My daughter was the one who found the listing, which is something I think about a lot now. Because if she hadn't been sitting at my kitchen table that Sunday, scrolling through job boards on my behalf, none of this would have my name attached to it. But I want to be clear from the start that this isn't a story about a broke man who took a desperate job. I had money. That's not the hook. And I'm tired of stories that pretend the only reason a person ends up somewhere strange is because they couldn't pay rent. I'd retired 2 years earlier, with a decent pension. 31 years as an air traffic controller. The last 11 of them at a mid-sized regional airport that I won't name but that you'd recognize if you flew the western routes. I'd retired clean, with a handshake and a cake and a plaque that's still in a box in my garage. The problem wasn't money. The problem was that I didn't know what to do with myself. I want to explain that, because it matters for everything after. When you spend 3 decades talking airplanes down out of the sky, your whole nervous system gets calibrated to a certain kind of attention. You learn to hold 12 things in your head at once, to hear a wrong number in a readback before your conscious mind catches it, to feel the shape of the airspace above you like it's a part of your own body. And then one day, they hand you a cake. And that whole apparatus has nothing to point at. I'd spend mornings reorganizing the garage. I'd watch the approach corridor from my back deck with a pair of binoculars, calling out the airline and type to nobody, just to keep the muscle from atrophying. My wife, Carol, had passed 4 years before any of this, and my daughter Megan lived 2 hours away with her own family. And the house was very quiet, and I was, if I'm honest, going a little strange in that quiet. So when Megan found the listing, she found it because she'd been worried about me. Part-time facilities monitor, it said. Decommissioned airfield. Overnight and weekend coverage. Aviation background preferred. She read it out loud, half as a joke, expecting me to wave it off. And instead I asked her to send me the link. The airfield was called Kessler Field, and it sat about 40 minutes north of me in a flat stretch of nothing that used to be farmland. It had been a real airport once, decades back. A regional strip with 2 runways and a little terminal and a control tower. And then the bigger airport down south had absorbed all its traffic, and Kessler had slowly died the way those places do. By the time I came to it, it had been formally decommissioned for over 20 years. No scheduled flights, no fuel service, no tower operations. What it had instead was a complicated ownership situation. A private holding company that maintained the property for reasons that were never made fully clear to me. Something about an FAA agreement and the cost of fully demolishing a field versus the cost of just keeping it from becoming a hazard. The runways were still there. The lighting was still there. The tower was still there. And somebody had to be on the property overnight to make sure kids didn't break in, that the gates stayed locked, that the emergency systems stayed within code, and that the lighting infrastructure, which was apparently still tied into some regional grid agreement, kept functioning. That was the job. Sit in a small office at the base of the old tower, do walking rounds of the property a few times a night, log the condition of the lighting and the perimeter, and call a number if anything was wrong. It was, on paper, the most boring job imaginable, and that was exactly why I wanted it. It put my old self back in a familiar place. The smell of jet fuel that never quite leaves a field. The particular flat dark of an airfield at night. I told Megan I'd take it just to have something to do. And she was so relieved I'd shown interest in anything that she didn't ask the questions she should have asked. The man who interviewed me was named Dale Furman, and he was the only other person I ever really dealt with at Kessler. He was the site supervisor, though I never figured out what he supervised besides me, and 2 other monitors I rarely overlapped with. He was maybe my age, lean, with a wind-burned face and the kind of squint people get from a lifetime outdoors. He'd flown crop dusters once, he told me, and there was something in the way he carried himself that made me trust him. A fellow member of the small club of people who've made their living in relation to the sky. The interview wasn't much of one. He looked at my certifications, asked me a few questions about my career, and seemed genuinely pleased that I'd been a controller. Good, he said, when I told him. Most of the fellas we get for this don't know a localizer from a lamppost. You'll understand the lighting at least. That's the part that matters. I asked him what he meant by that. Why the lighting was the part that mattered on a field with no flights. And he said something I didn't think about until much later. He said, "The lights are the only thing here that still does its job." He hired me on the spot and walked me out to see the place properly. It was late afternoon, the sun going low and orange across the flat land. And Kessler in that light was almost beautiful. The two runways crossed each other in a long X. The asphalt cracked and weeded, but still readable as runways. The painted numbers faded, but there. The taxiways branched off them. The old terminal sat low and dark, its windows boarded. A building that had clearly been empty for a generation. And the tower rose up at the center of it. 4 stories of concrete with the glass cab at the top, the glass gone milky and dim. A structure that had once been the brain of the whole field and was now just a place for a retired man to sit at night. Dale showed me the office at the base of the tower. It was a single room with a desk, a space heater, a coffee maker that looked older than the field, a bank of light switches and breakers along one wall, and a metal cabinet full of logbooks and manuals. There was a landline phone, beige, the kind with the coiled cord. There was a CB-style radio on the desk, an old one, that Dale said I should leave on, but never use. "It doesn't transmit," he said. "Hasn't for years. It just listens to the field frequency. Sometimes you'll get noise on it. Atmospheric stuff, other fields bleeding over. Don't worry about it." I asked why keep it on at all, if it didn't transmit and only caught noise. He thought about that for a second. "Procedure," he said. "Same reason we keep the lights working. The agreement says the field stays operational even though it isn't. You'll get used to the difference. Operational and active aren't the same word." And then he showed me the lighting board. And that was where the real job lived. The lighting board controlled the entire field's lighting infrastructure, which was extensive and, I learned, still fully maintained at significant expense. The runway edge lights, the threshold lights, the centerline lighting on the main runway, the approach lighting system that stretched out past the runway end, the rotating beacon on top of the tower, the obstruction lights, the taxiway lighting. All of it still worked. All of it was still powered. And my job, the actual core of it, was to manage that lighting according to a schedule and a set of rules, and to log the state of every system several times a night. Dale walked me through the rules, and like everything in these situations, they sounded like nothing at first. They were typed on a laminated card clipped to the lighting board, worn soft at the edges. The first rule was that the runway and approach lighting were to be kept on a specific schedule. On at dusk. Off at a precise time each morning. Never adjusted manually except under the conditions listed below. The second rule was that the rotating beacon on top of the tower was never to be turned off, under any circumstances, for any reason, even during maintenance. The third rule said that if the approach lighting system for runway 22 came on by itself, outside the schedule, I was to log the exact time, note it, and leave it on. I was not to turn it off. The fourth rule said that if I observed any aircraft lighting in the approach corridor for runway 22, landing lights, navigation lights, any aircraft lighting at all. I was to remain in the office, log the time, and not go out onto the field until the lighting in the corridor had been clear for a minimum of 30 minutes. The fifth rule said that the radio was to remain on the field frequency at all times, and that I was never to respond to any transmission, regardless of content. I read those rules standing next to Dale with the orange light coming through the office window. And I want to tell you honestly what I thought. Because it's important that you understand, I'm not a credulous man. I thought they were exactly the kind of rules you'd expect at a place like this. A decommissioned field still tied into a regional lighting agreement would have automated systems, and automated systems glitch. The approach lighting coming on by itself was an electrical fault. And the rule about logging it and leaving it on was just liability language. Don't touch the malfunctioning system. Let the contractor handle it. The rule about aircraft in the corridor was about not wandering onto a live runway. Basic safety. The kind of rule that exists because somebody once got hurt. And the radio rule was just Dale's way of saying, don't waste your time talking to static. I'd spent 31 years around aviation rules that all traced back to somebody dying somewhere. And I read these the same way. Old rules, written in blood. The way all good aviation rules are. I asked Dale about Runway 22 specifically. Why it had its own rules. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the field. And then he said, 22's the one that points northeast. The approach corridor runs out over the old Hadley Farms. It's the runway most of the traffic used to come in on, back when there was traffic. The wind favors it. He paused. The lighting on 22 is the most temperamental. That's all. It acts up more than the rest. You'll see. That was the first time he used that phrase, you'll see. And I'd heard it from him more than once in the weeks that followed, always at the moment a real explanation should have come. He had me shadow him for 3 nights before I went solo. They were good nights, honestly. We'd do the rounds together, walking the perimeter with flashlights, checking the gates, and he'd point out the history of the place, where the fuel farm used to be, where a small plane had gone off the end of the runway in the 70s, where the old crash truck was still parked in a collapsing shed. He knew the field the way I'd known my airspace, intimately, fondly, and I liked him. Around the middle of each night, we'd sit in the office and drink the bad coffee, and he'd tell me stories. And the rotating beacon would sweep its light around and around, overhead. Green and white, throwing a moving shadow across the office wall every few seconds. A rhythm I got used to fast. The thing I noticed in those 3 nights, the first small thing, was the lighting schedule. The card said the runway lighting came on at dusk and went off at a precise time each morning. The time was 4:47 a.m. Not 5, not 4:30, not civil twilight. 4:47 exactly. I asked Dale about it the second night because as a controller, precise odd numbers always meant something to me. They were never arbitrary. And 4:47 wasn't a round number or a twilight time or anything I could account for. Dale was refilling his coffee. He didn't turn around. That's when they go off, he said. Always been 4:47, before my time. I just keep the schedule. And then, because I kept looking at him, he added, don't change it. The system's set to it. Changing it causes problems. What kind of problems? I asked. You'll see, he said. I went solo on a Thursday. Dale shook my hand and gave me his cell number and told me to call if anything came up. And then he drove off in his pickup down the long access road. And his taillights got small and disappeared, and for the first time I was alone at Kessler Field. I'll tell you, the first few weeks solo were the best I'd felt since I retired. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because the contrast matters. I had a purpose again. I had a field again. I'd come on at dusk and run the lighting up and watch the whole airfield bloom into light across the dark land. The runways laid out in glowing lines, the approach lighting marching out into the dark like a ladder. The beacons sweeping overhead. There's nothing like a lit airfield at night. It's one of the most beautiful things a person can make. And I had it all to myself. 4 stories of tower and 2 miles of runway and all that light. And I'd do my rounds and my logs, and I felt, for a few weeks, like myself. I developed routines. I'd bring a thermos of my own coffee because the office coffee was undrinkable. I'd do my first round at 10, my second at 1, my third at 4. I'd sit in the office between rounds and read, or I'd climb up into the old tower cab, which I wasn't strictly forbidden from doing, and sit up there in the dark with the field spread out below me and pretend, a little, that I was working again. The cab was a ruin, the equipment stripped out, the chairs gone, the glass milky. But you could still stand at the windows and see the whole field, and I liked it up there. The logs were simple. I logged the lighting state, the perimeter condition, and the radio status. Page after page of normal. I read back through the older logs in the cabinet, the way you do, and they were the same. Decades of normal, runway lighting nominal, perimeter secure, radio quiet. Different handwriting over the years, the monitors who'd come before me, but the same entries. It was comforting. I wasn't doing anything strange. I was just the latest in a long line of men who'd sat at this desk and kept the lights on a dead field, except the first thing I couldn't explain came in my 4th week solo. And it was the approach lighting on runway 22. I was in the office at about 2 in the morning, between rounds, reading. The lighting board had a row of indicator lights showing the state of each system, green for on, dark for off. And I'd glance at it now and then, out of habit. Everything was on its schedule. And then I glanced up and the indicator for the runway 22 approach lighting system, which should have been on like everything else, was doing something the others weren't. It was flickering, not the steady green of a system that's on. A flutter, like the indicator couldn't decide. I got up and looked at it. And then I looked out the office window toward the approach end of 22. And I could see it out there. The approach lighting, which was a long line of light bars stretching out past the runway threshold into the dark farmland. It should have been steady. Instead, it was sequencing. The lights were flashing in sequence, running toward the runway, bar after bar, lighting up in a wave that rolled in from the dark toward the threshold and then started over. Off. Then a wave of light rolling in, then off, then again. Now, I knew what that was. That's a real thing. It's called sequenced flashing lights, or the rabbit. And it's part of an approach lighting system, a strobe sequence that runs toward the runway to guide a pilot's eye into the threshold on final approach. Every controller knows it. It's a normal, ordinary piece of airport infrastructure. The rabbit runs to bring a pilot in. But the rabbit isn't supposed to run on its own. It's not part of a static lighting schedule. The sequenced flashers are a separate system, and at a live airport, they'd be on when there was traffic on the approach. At a dead airport, on a decommissioned runway with no flights and no pilots, the rabbit should never run at all. It had no reason to. There was nothing to guide in. I stood at the window and watched it run. The wave of light rolling in from the dark toward the threshold, over and over, bringing in an airplane that wasn't there. I remembered the rule. If the approach lighting system for runway 22 came on by itself, outside the schedule, log the time, note it, leave it on, don't turn it off. So that's what I did. I went to the logbook and I wrote, 2:14 a.m., RWI 22 approach lighting sequencing, SFL active, outside schedule. Logged per procedure, left on. And I underlined per procedure, the way you do when you want the record to show you followed the rule, because some part of me was already thinking about how this would look if anyone ever read it. I told myself it was a fault. Sequenced flashers running on their own were a controller relay sticking, a timer malfunctioning, an electrical ghost in an old system. Dale had said 22's lighting was temperamental. This was the temperament he meant. I made myself believe that, and I went and did my 4 o'clock round. And when I came back, the rabbit was still running. And at 4:47 exactly, when the whole field's lighting shut off on schedule, the rabbit shut off with it, and the field went dark, and the only thing left was the beacon sweeping overhead. The rabbit ran 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, always on 22, always in the small hours. Each time I logged it per procedure and left it on, and each time it shut off at 4:47 with the rest of the lighting. And I built my wall of ordinary explanations and lived behind it. Faulty timer, sticking relay, old field. What started to crack the wall was the radio. The radio sat on the desk and on the field frequency, doing nothing, the way Dale said it would, mostly silence, occasionally a wash of static, very rarely a fragment of some distant transmission bleeding over from another field, a word or two of a clearance or a position report, gone as fast as it came. I'd gotten used to ignoring it. The rules said never respond, and there was never anything to respond to. But I started to notice that the radio got busy when the rabbit ran. The two went together. On the nights the approach lighting on 22 sequenced on its own, the radio would come alive, not with static, but with transmission, fragments of voices. And they were aviation voices, clipped, professional, the cadence of pilots and controllers, the specific compressed rhythm of radio communication that I'd lived inside for 31 years and could recognize in my sleep. I couldn't make out words at first, just the shape of it, the back and forth. A transmission, a pause, a response, the rhythm of an aircraft talking to a tower. Except Kessler had no tower. The cab above me was a stripped-out ruin. There was no controller. There was no one for an aircraft to talk to. And there were no aircraft. I want to be honest about how I handled this, because it's not flattering. The professional in me, the part that had spent 3 decades listening to exactly this kind of traffic, desperately wanted to understand what I was hearing. And the rules said never respond. And I followed the rule. But following the rule isn't the same as not listening. I listened hard. I started turning the squelch down on those nights to pull the fragments up out of the noise, leaning over the radio with my ear to the speaker, trying to resolve the words. I told myself I was just being thorough. A good monitor should know what's coming over his equipment. But the truth is, I was hungry for it. It was the sound of my old life, my old self, the thing I'd lost when they gave me the cake. And it was coming up out of a dead radio on a dead field, and I couldn't make myself stop reaching for it. The first time I made out actual words was a Tuesday, about 3 weeks after the rabbit started. The approach lighting on 22 was sequencing. The radio was busy. I had the squelch down and my ear closed. And out of the wash of voices, a single transmission came up clear. Clear enough that I could hear it was a man. Calm, professional. The unmistakable flat effect of a pilot reading back a clearance. He said, "Kessler Tower, tailwind 492, with you on the visual. Runway 22. And then the response. And this is the part I've never been able to put down. the part that took the wall apart. The response came over the radio too, a different voice, also calm, also professional, the cadence of a controller. And it said, "Tailwind 492, Kessler Tower, runway 22 cleared to land, winds calm." There was a tower controller answering. On a field with no tower, clearing an aircraft to land on a runway that hadn't seen a scheduled flight in over 20 years. And the approach lighting was running to bring that aircraft in. The Rabbit rolling its wave of light toward the threshold, guiding something down out of the dark. I sat back from the radio. The beacon swept overhead, green and white, green and white. And I did something I shouldn't have. I broke the procedure, not the never response rule. I didn't touch the transmitter. But the other one, Rule 4, the one that said if I observed aircraft lighting in the approach corridor for 22, I was to stay in the office and not go onto the field. I got up and I went to the window, and I looked out at the approach corridor for runway 22, out past the threshold, out over where Dale had said the old Hadley farms were. And I looked for landing lights. There weren't any. The corridor was dark, except for the Rabbit running its sequence along the ground. No aircraft lights, no airplanes. Just a tower clearing a flight to land and the lights running to bring it in, and the empty black sky over the farms where the airplane should have been. I stood there for a long time. I'm not sure how long. The radio kept up behind me. The back and forth, more aircraft now, I realized. Not just the one. Kessler Tower, Meridian 61, 10 miles out, inbound 22. Meridian 61, Kessler, number 2 behind a tailwind, continue. A sequence of flights, stacking up, inbound to a dead field, talking to a tower that wasn't there, being brought in by lights running for no one. I knew that rhythm so well. It was a busy approach. It was a tower working a sequence of arrivals on a good night with calm winds. It was the sound of the best part of my old job. And it was happening at a place where none of it was real. At 4:47, the lighting shut off. The Rabbit stopped, and the radio went silent. Mid-transmission cut off clean. A controller's voice clipped off in the middle of a word, and the field went dark, and the beacon kept sweeping, and I was standing at the window of a dead tower with my heart going hard. I should have called Dale. I should have done a lot of things. Instead, I went to the cabinet, and I started pulling the old logbooks, because I needed to know if this had always happened, if the men before me had heard the tower too, and what they'd done about it. They had logged the Rabbit. That was the first thing. Going back years, decades, the same entry I'd been writing, RWY 22 approach lighting sequencing outside schedule, logged per procedure, left on. It had always happened. Dozens of monitors, the same entry, the same restraint. None of them mentioned the radio. None of them mentioned the tower. Just the lights. Logged, left on, per procedure, the wall of normal. But there was one logbook, an older one, the binding cracked. That was different. The handwriting in it was a man named, according to the sign-in, J. Petrosky. And he'd worked the field a long time, years of entries in his steady hand. And then, in his last few months, the entries started to change. He kept logging the Rabbit per procedure, but he started adding things in the margins, small notes in pencil, like he didn't want them in the official ink. Next to one Rabbit entry he'd written, in pencil, counted 6 inbound tonight. Next to another, same tailwind call sign as last week. And then, a few pages later, next to a normal Rabbit entry, in pencil, pressed harder. They're not arrivals. They never land. Listen at 4:47. I read that line 3 times. Listen at 4:47. I'd never listened to 4:47. The lighting shut off at 4:47 and the radio went silent, and I'd always taken that silence as the end of it. The system going dark, the night ending. I'd never thought to listen to the silence itself. Petrosky was telling me to listen at the exact moment everything turned off. I kept turning pages. Petrosky's entries got sparser. His pencil notes got worse. Next to one of his last rabbit entries, he'd written, "The 4:47 isn't a shut-off. It's a landing time." And then, lower, almost off the bottom of the page, "If you ever hear one of them land, do not be on the field. Do not be in the tower." Petrosky's handwriting stopped a few pages later, mid-month. No notice, no final entry, just the last log in his hand. And then a new monitor's handwriting, picking up the schedule like nothing had happened. Runway lighting nominal, perimeter secure, radio quiet. I sat with that logbook in the dark office for a long time. The beacon swept overhead. I told myself Petrosky had lost it, that men go strange working alone on dead fields, that I was half going strange myself out here, that pencil notes in the margin of a logbook weren't evidence of anything except a lonely man's imagination. I built that wall as fast as I could. But I'd been a controller for 31 years, and there's one thing you cannot unknow once you've done that job. You know what a landing sounds like on the radio. You know the whole sequence of it, the handoff, the clearance, the readback. And then the thing at the end, the thing that closes it, the moment the aircraft is down and the tower tells it where to go. Taxi to the gate, contact ground. The conversation that only happens after the wheels are on the ground. In all the busy approaches I'd heard come up out of that dead radio, all the inbound flights stacking up on 22, I had never once heard that. I'd never heard of one land. I'd heard them called in, cleared, sequenced, brought down toward the threshold by the running lights. And then 4:47 would come, and everything would cut off, and they'd be gone. Every night, the same flights, the same call signs, the same tailwind, cleared to land, and never landing. They never land. The next night, I came in at dusk and ran up the lighting and did my rounds and waited. And a little after 2, the indicator for the 22 approach lightings started to flutter. And out past the threshold, the rabbit began to run. Its wave of light rolling in from the dark over the Hadley farms. And the radio came alive with the calm professional voices. The tower clearing the inbounds one by one. And this time, I didn't build a wall. This time, I sat down at the desk. And I put my ear close to the radio. And I made myself a promise that I'd do the one thing none of the other logbooks mentioned. The one thing Petrosky had written down in pencil and then disappeared. I was going to be awake and listening at 4:47. And I was going to find out what it sounds like when one of them finally lands. I want to tell you that I stayed at the desk like I'd promised myself. I didn't. Somewhere around 3, with the rabbit running and the radio working its sequence of inbounds, I got it into my head that the desk wasn't the right place to listen. The desk was at the base of the tower. If 4:47 was a landing time, the way Petrosky's pencil said, then the place to understand it was up top, in the cab, where I could see the whole approach corridor laid out, where a controller would have sat to bring those flights down. The old part of me, the part they'd given a cake to, wanted the view. I told myself it was the smart move, the thorough move. It was really just the hungry one. So I went up. 4 flights of concrete stairs in the dark, the stairwell smelling of dust and cold metal and the faint mineral damp those towers always have. My flashlight throwing my shadow up the walls ahead of me. The radio I left running below, but I'd brought a handheld scanner I'd bought years ago and never gotten rid of. an old hobby thing, and I had it clipped to my belt tuned to the field frequency so I wouldn't lose the traffic. That was the first real decision I made that I can't take back. I brought my own radio up into the cab. The cab at night, with the field lit below, was the most like my old life I'd felt in years, and I'm ashamed of how good it felt. The milky glass cleared up some at night with the lights below it, and I could see the whole field, both runways in their glowing lines, the taxiways, and out past the threshold of 22, the rabbit running its wave toward me, toward the tower, bringing them in. The scanner on my belt kept up its quiet back and forth. Tailwind 4902 on a 5-mile final. Meridian 61 number 2. A third one now. A call sign I didn't catch. Checking in from the northeast. A busy night. A good night. Calm winds. And I stood at the cab window, where a controller would have stood, and I watched the empty corridor and listened to the traffic and waited for 4:47. It came the way it always came. No drama to it. The clock on my phone rolling from 4:46 to 4:47, and the field lighting cut off all at once, the way it did every night. The runways went dark. The rabbit stopped mid-wave. The board below me would be showing all dark now. Every system off on schedule, the night ending. And the scanner on my belt went silent. The controller's voice clipped off. The same clean cut I heard every night from the office. Except up in the cab, it wasn't the same. Down in the office, the silence at 4:47 had always been the end of it. Up in the cab, with the whole corridor in front of me and my ear trained by 31 years, I heard what the office walls had been keeping from me. The scanner didn't go fully silent. Under the cutoff, very low, there was something still coming through. Not the clipped professional voices, something underneath them that the louder traffic had always covered. A sound I knew and couldn't place for a second, and then placed and wished I hadn't. It was the sound of an aircraft on rollout, the rumble and rush of a large airplane on the ground after touchdown, the reverse thrust spooling up, that long, decelerating roar that you feel in your chest more than hear. It was coming over the scanner, and it was also, I realized, standing very still at the cab window, coming from outside, from the field, from runway 22. There was nothing on runway 22. The lights were off. The corridor was black. The sky over the Hadley Farms was empty. No landing lights, no nav lights. Nothing. Exactly like every other night. But the sound of a heavy jet rolling out was moving down the center line of 22 in the dark. From the threshold toward the far end. The roar traveling along the runway, past the base of the tower and away. The way the sound of a real landing aircraft would track past you if you stood in a real tower on a real night. I felt it in the glass. The cab windows buzzed faintly the way they do when something big goes by. And then, at the far end of the dark runway, the roar settled. The reverse thrust spooled down, and the sound became the lower idle of an aircraft slowing to taxi speed. And then it turned. The sound of it turning off the runway onto a taxiway. And then it was coming back, toward the tower, toward me. I did not move from the window. I want to say I did, that some good instinct took over. But I stood there, and I watched the dark taxiway where the sound was, and there was nothing to see. No shape, no lights. Just the sound of a large aircraft taxiing in the dark. The idle of its engines, the squeak and groan of a heavy thing on its gear rolling slow over old asphalt, coming up the taxiway toward the ramp in front of the tower. The same ramp where, decades ago, the real flights would have parked, and the scanner on my belt which should have been dead silent at 4:51 in the morning on a decommissioned field, said in the calm, flat voice of the tower controller I'd been hearing for weeks, "Tailwind 4902, taxi to the ramp. Welcome to Kessler." And a different voice. The pilot, tired, the way pilots sound at the end of a long flight, said, "Taxi to the ramp, 4902. Long night. Thanks for getting us in. I have gone over what I did next more times than I can count. And I still don't fully understand the impulse, except that it was the deepest impulse I had. Deeper than fear. The thing 31 years builds into you. When you hear traffic on a frequency you're working, you answer. It is not a decision. It is a reflex, worn so deep it's below the level of decisions. The pilot had said thanks for getting us in, and there was a beat of dead air where the tower should have come back with something. The little human close out. And the silence of that beat pulled at me the way an unfinished sentence pulls at you. And before I knew I was doing it, my thumb had found the transmit on the handheld scanner, and I'd keyed it, and I'd said, 4902 Kessler, no problem, good night. I want to be clear about what I did, because it matters. The radio in the office didn't transmit. Dale had told me that, and it was true, it hadn't transmitted in years. But the handheld on my belt was mine, and it did. I keyed it. I answered. After all the weeks of following Rule 5, never responding, regardless of content, I broke it on reflex, with my own equipment, standing in the tower at 4:51 in the morning, and I said goodnight to something that had just landed in aircraft on an empty runway, in the dark. The scanner went quiet. Outside, the idle of the taxiing aircraft stopped. Not faded. Stopped, the way an engine stops when it's shut down. The whine spooling down to nothing. And then there was no sound at all on the field, none. The most complete silence I'd ever heard out there. And into that silence, the tower controller's voice came back over the scanner. And it was different now. It wasn't talking to Tailwind 4902 anymore. The cadence changed. It got slower. It said, Kessler Tower, identify the station that just transmitted. I stood there with the handheld in my hand and my thumb off the transmitter, and I did not answer. Of course I didn't answer. But it had heard me. Whatever was running that frequency, whatever had spent weeks bringing flights down out of an empty sky, had heard a new voice come up on its frequency. A voice that answered it. That closed the loop, that talked back the way a tower talks to a plane, and it wanted to know who I was. Station transmitting on Kessler Tower, identified. Say position. Calm, patient. The exact tone I'd used 1,000 times myself when an unknown aircraft popped up on my frequency, and I needed to find it. The tone of a controller locating traffic. I did the only smart thing I did that entire night. I turned the handheld off. I clicked it dead, and I clipped it to my belt. And I went down the 4 flights of stairs faster than I should have in the dark. And I got into the office. And I sat down at the desk. And I did not touch anything. And the office radio, the one that doesn't transmit, was silent the way it always was at that hour. And outside the field was dark and empty, and there was no aircraft on the ramp because there was never any aircraft on the ramp. And I told myself I had imagined the rollout, the taxi, the buzz in the glass, all of it, because I was a lonely man going strange on a dead field at 5 in the morning. I wrote nothing in the log about the cab. I wrote 4:47 a.m., lighting off on schedule, RWI 22. SFL ceased. Radio quiet, perimeter secure, clean, easy to read, the exact entry the men before me had written for decades, and I understood, signing it, that I had just learned the real reason they all wrote the same thing. It wasn't that nothing happened. It was that you wrote that nothing happened. The clean entry wasn't a record of the night. It was the job, the actual product. A logbook full of nothing, going back decades. So that anybody who ever looked would see a dead field where the lights came on by themselves, sometimes due to an electrical fault, and nothing more. I drove home in the gray dawn, and I didn't sleep. I sat on my back deck with the binoculars I used to use to watch the approach corridor at the real airport. And I didn't pick them up. I just sat there until the sun was full up. And Megan called, like she did most mornings now, to check on me. And I told her the job was good. I told her it was good for me. That part was even still partly true, which is the thing I can't get past. I'd found something out there that scared me more than anything in 31 years of holding lives in my hands. And I still didn't want to leave it, because it was the only place left where the best part of me had nothing to do. I called Dale that afternoon. I told myself I was going to ask him directly. No more of his, you'll see. That I'd describe what I'd heard and watch his face. Except it was a phone call, so there was no face. I got as far as telling him the rabbit had been running a lot, and that the radio got busy when it did. And I heard him go quiet on the other end, in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. And then he said in a careful voice, "You didn't go up in the cab, did you? When the radio's busy." I lied to him. I said no. I said I'd stayed in the office per procedure. I don't know exactly why I lied, except that admitting I'd been in the cab felt like admitting I'd done something I'd be blamed for. And the fear of being blamed is older in me than almost anything. It goes back to the job. To 31 years of knowing that if a plane goes down on your watch, the first thing that happens is they pull your tapes and look for what you did wrong. So I lied. And Dale was quiet again. And then he said, "Good. Stay out of the cab when 22's working. The office is the place. The walls of the office are the place. Do you understand me? The office is rated. The cab isn't." Rated. He said the office was rated, like it was a piece of safety equipment. I asked what it was rated for. And for the first time, Dale didn't say, "You'll see." He said slow, like he was deciding how much to hand me. "The agreement keeps the lights on, so the field reads as operational. You understand the difference now, operational and active. As long as the field reads operational, the traffic that's inbound stays inbound. It keeps coming in. It keeps getting brought down. That's the whole arrangement. The lights are an invitation that never has to be honored, you follow. They come in on the approach, and the field's lit, and the tower works them. And then 447 comes, and the field goes dark before any of them are really down. And they go back to being inbound. And the next night, they come in again. That's the job. Keeping them inbound. Keeping them from finishing." I asked him, and my voice wasn't steady. "What happens if one finishes? If one lands?" "Then it's down," Dale said. "Then it's here. Then it's not a flight anymore. It's an arrival. And arrivals have to go somewhere. And there's nowhere at Kessler for them to go because the field's been dead 20 years. So it looks for the tower. It looks for the controller who brought it in, because that's who an arrival reports to. And there's not supposed to be one. That's the whole point. There's supposed to be lights and no controller. A field that invites but never answers." He paused, and then he said the thing that put it all together and took the last of the floor out from under me. "The radio doesn't transmit for a reason. We took the transmitter out of every radio on this field years ago. Not because it was broken, because the one thing you can never do, the thing the whole arrangement depends on, is answer one of them. The second something on that frequency hears an answer, it knows there's a controller here after all. And then it's not inbound anymore. Then it's got somewhere to report to. Then it lands." I sat in my kitchen holding the phone, and I did not tell Dale that I had answered. I had a handheld that transmitted, that I'd brought up into the cab, that I'd keyed at 4:51 in the morning to say goodnight to Tailwind 4902. And Dale was telling me that the one thing that could never happen was the exact thing I'd done. And I did not tell him. I said something about understanding, about staying in the office, and I got off the phone. And I sat there for a long time while the afternoon went down. Here is the part where I had a clear choice and made the cowardly version of it. I could have called Dale back and told him the truth. I could have told him I'd answered, that something had asked me to identify, that I'd run. Maybe there was something to be done, some procedure for exactly this. Some reason the office was raided that would have protected me or someone. Instead, I decided I'd handle it myself. I told myself that one transmission, late at night, from a low-power handheld, half a closeout, good night, couldn't be enough to undo decades of arrangement. I told myself the field had gone dark at 4:47 like always, that the rollout I'd heard was my tired mind, that nothing had actually landed. I built the wall one more time, and I built it specifically so I wouldn't have to admit to Dale, or to myself, that I might have broken the one rule that mattered. The fear of being blamed won again. It usually does with me. That's the truest thing I can tell you about myself. I went back to work the next night, because not going back felt like admitting something was wrong, and admitting something was wrong meant admitting what I'd done. The field was normal at dusk. I ran the lighting up. I did my rounds. The rabbit didn't run that night, or the next, and the radio stayed quiet. And I started to believe I'd been right, that it was nothing, that I'd scared myself over a tired man's hallucination and some pencil notes from another tired man 20 years gone. It was the fourth night after that the new thing started, and it was small, and it was worse than anything loud could have been. I was in the office at about 1, doing my logs, and the office radio crackled, just once, and a voice came over it, low, the tower controller's calm, flat cadence, and it didn't call a flight. It said, "Kessler Tower, station that transmitted on the 14th, say position." The 14th, the night I'd answered. It had the date. It was looking for me. By the date I'd come up on its frequency, the way I'd have looked for a primary target that squawked once and went dark. Working the airspace methodically, calling in the blind, say position, until the unknown traffic answered or went away. The office radio doesn't transmit. I knew that. Dale had said it. I'd confirmed it. It had no transmit. It physically could not answer. So I sat there, and I let it call, say position, every few minutes, calm and patient and unhurried, all night, and at 4:47, it stopped and I wrote in the log. Radio quiet, because there was no honest entry I could write that wouldn't be the end of me. And I drove home, shaking. It called every night after that. The same line, the date, say position. It was the only thing the radio ever said now. The rabbit didn't run anymore. The inbound traffic was gone. The busy approaches, the tailwinds and meridians stacking up. All of that had stopped the night I answered. There was just the one voice now, looking for the controller who'd come up on its frequency and then vanished, working the problem the way I'd have worked it, patiently, professionally, for as long as it took. Because that's the thing about a controller, real or whatever that voice was. We don't lose traffic. We don't stop looking for an aircraft or a station that's out there somewhere not answering. We can't. It's not in us. We work it until it's resolved. I understood then what Petrosky had meant. Do not be on the field. Do not be in the tower. He'd never said don't answer because it had never occurred to him you could. because his radio didn't transmit either. He'd thought the danger was being seen, being on the field when one finished. He hadn't known the worst danger was being heard. I'd found a way to do the one thing the whole arrangement was built to prevent. And I'd done it with equipment I brought from home. And now the thing that brought flights down was looking for me specifically. And there was no rule in the laminated card for that, because nobody who'd ever made that mistake had lived at the desk long enough to write the rule. I thought about quitting. I want that on the record, because it's a decent impulse, and I did at least have it. I thought, just stop going. Let the next monitor take the desk. Let the voice call say position into an empty office forever. But I'd answered from the cab, with my own radio. And I'd given it nothing to find, no name, no position, just a voice and a date. As long as I stayed away, it had a date and a voice, and no station. But I'd started to understand how it worked. The way you come to understand any system you live inside long enough. And I understood that a thing that methodical, that patient, looking for an unknown station on a field with exactly one occupied desk, was going to keep working the problem. And the problem had only one solution out there. One place a controller could be. If I left, the desk wouldn't be empty for long. They'd hire someone. Megan would find them a man going strange in a quiet house, or Dale would. And that man would sit at the rated desk, and the voice would still be calling say position every night. And one night, that new man, not knowing what I knew, might do the thing I did, might answer. And then it wouldn't be looking anymore. It would have found its controller. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that kept me showing up. It wasn't bravery. It was that I'd opened the door, and I was the only one who knew it was open. And leaving meant handing the open door to a stranger. And I'd spent 31 years being the man who didn't hand off unresolved traffic. So I kept going. Not to fix it. I didn't know how to fix it. I went to keep my body in the rated office every night, so that the voice calling for a station would keep getting no answer, because I was the only one who knew not to give it one. I made myself the seal on the thing I'd cracked. I told Dale a version of it finally, weeks in, the version that protected me. I told him the radio had started calling for a station, a date, a position. I watched his face this time, because I drove out and met him at the field at dusk to say it in person. And his wind-burned face went still and old. And he didn't ask me how the radio could be calling for a station that transmitted on a particular night if I'd stayed in the office like I'd told him. He didn't ask, and I understood from the not asking that he knew. He'd known since my phone call. Maybe he'd known since he hired a retired controller, the one kind of man whose reflexes would betray him in exactly that way. The one kind of man who'd answer. Maybe that's why he'd been pleased I was a controller. Maybe a controller is what the desk needs, eventually. Someone who'll keep the traffic inbound because he understands it, and who, if he ever slips, becomes the seal himself. Bound to the desk by his own mistake, unable to leave because leaving lets it in. "You're going to keep coming," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "You understand why now, so you'll keep coming." And then he said the only kind thing, or the only thing that sounded kind. "It'll keep asking. It won't stop. But as long as you're in the office and you never answer it again, it stays inbound. The whole field is built to keep them inbound forever. You're part of how it does that now. That's not the worst job a man can have." He looked out at the field, the way he always did when he was deciding how much to say. Petrosky kept coming too, a long time, longer than the log shows. The log just stops because he stopped writing the date down. I didn't ask what happened to Petrosky. I've thought about asking. I never have. Some part of me has decided that not knowing is the last wall I get to keep, and I'm keeping it. So that's where I am. And it's where I've been for a while now. And I don't see an end to it. I come on at dusk. I run the lighting up. And the field blooms across the dark land, beautiful. An invitation that can never be honored. I do my rounds. I do not go up in the cab. I sit in the rated office at the rated desk, and around 1 or 2, the radio crackles, and the calm, flat voice says, Kessler Tower, station that transmitted on the 14th, say position. And I sit with my hands flat on the desk, and I do not answer. And I write radio quiet in the log in clean letters anyone could read. And at 4:47 it stops, and the field goes dark. And I drive home and tell Megan the job is good for me. The strange thing, the thing I can't make her or anyone understand, is that it is. I'm needed. I have traffic to hold. The apparatus they built in me over 31 years finally has something to point at again. Even if the thing it's pointing at is a voice that's looking for me. Even if the job is just making sure I never slip again the way I slipped once. I left the handheld at home. I want to know. I don't bring my own radio to the field anymore. I'm not stupid. But I'll tell you the thing that happened last week. The thing that's why I'm finally saying any of this out loud. The thing I haven't been able to build a wall around. Last week, the office radio called for a station like it does every night. But the line was different. It didn't say the station that transmitted on the 14th. For weeks, months, it had said the 14th, the date I answered, the unknown traffic it was trying to locate. Last week, at about 1 in the morning, the radio crackled, and the calm, flat tower voice came up, and it didn't ask for a station anymore. It used a call sign, a new one I'd never heard in all the inbound traffic. It said very calmly, the way a tower calls a flight, it's been working for a while, and knows by now. It said my name, my actual name, the way you'd say a call sign. And then it said, say position, you're cleared to land. It's not looking for an unknown station anymore. Somewhere in all those nights of me sitting at the desk not answering, it stopped treating me as traffic it couldn't find, and started treating me as traffic it's bringing in. I'm not the controller, it's hunting now. I'm on its frequency, I have a call sign, and I'm inbound. The field is lit, the approach is open, and every night now the voice tells me, by name, calm and patient and certain, that I'm cleared to land. I haven't answered. I sit at the rated desk with my hands flat, and I don't key anything. I don't have anything to key. I left the handheld at home. But I've started to understand that the rated office and the never answering were only ever meant to handle a station that could choose not to transmit. They were never built to handle traffic that's already inbound, already in the pattern, already being worked toward a runway. You can refuse to be a controller. I don't think you can refuse a flight. And I keep thinking about the rollout sound I heard that night in the cab, the heavy jet coming down 22 in the dark, the reverse thrust, the taxi back toward the tower. And I keep thinking that I never actually saw it leave. That 4:47 only ever shut the lights off. That maybe nothing inbound ever really goes back to being inbound at all. Maybe they just circle, all of them, all the tailwinds and meridians, and now me, stacked up over the Hadley farms in the dark forever, cleared to land on a field that goes dark before any of us can finish. I still go in every night. I tell myself it's to keep the seal, to keep the new man from sitting at the desk and slipping the way I slipped. But I know now that's not the whole reason. The whole reason is that I'm cleared to land. And I'm tired, the way the pilot sounded tired long night. And there's a part of me, the part they gave a cake to, the part that's been circling in the dark over the farms with nothing to point at for years, that wants very badly to come down. I sit at the desk every night with my hands flat, and I listen to a voice tell me by name that I'm cleared to land. And the only thing keeping me inbound is that I haven't answered yet. I haven't answered yet. I keep telling Megan the job is good for me, and I keep going in at dusk, and I keep my hands flat on the desk. And every night the field lights up across the dark land, beautiful, an invitation. And every night the voice says my name and tells me I'm cleared. And every night it gets a little harder to remember why a man would stay up here, circling in the cold, when the runway's right there, lit, waiting, and someone calm and patient is telling him it's all right to come down.